Hey everyone, so I just wanted to make a video in this series on Celtic or Irish rhythm guitar for beginners about gear. So I quite often get asked, what pick am I using, what strings am I using? So I'm going to answer those questions in this video, and I'm also going to talk about, guitars in general and some other bits of equipment that you can use to make learning this style a bit easier for you, and they're also going to help you get a nicer tone from your guitar overall. So if we start by talking about just guitars in general, I'm a big believer that you don't need an expensive guitar to sound good, okay? So one thing I would say is you can play any kind of guitar. You can play a steel string acoustic, you can play a nylon string, you can even learn this style on electric guitar if you want, but if you want to go for the same sort of sound as I've got in these videos and as most kind of Celtic guitarists, the sound most Celtic guitarists choose to have, it's normally a steel string guitar, and then a few use nylon strings. But one thing I would say is you can play a super cheap guitar, but if you want to make life a little bit easier for you, if you go over the sort of around £400 mark, you'll find that the guitars past that point, they'll stay in tune a little bit better for you, and their intonation is generally better as well. So if you don't know what intonation is, basically on a guitar like this, if I play an open E string and then I fret a note higher up, so I fret another E up on the 12th fret, they're the same note, okay? So there might be slight variations, but they're nothing that's going to cause you any problems. But on a cheaper guitar, sometimes the intonation is not quite as good, so I might play an open E, and then on the 12th it'll be, and then you can run into problems if you're wanting to play any of the kind of chords that I was playing in the beginning of the video or things like that. So I would recommend spending just a little bit more, and instead of spending £200, you could spend £400, and you get guitar that's going to be more enjoyable to learn on in general. Okay, but I think once you get past the £400 mark, I've said this in previous videos, but until you hit about £800 or £900, there's not much of a difference between the quality. Okay, so this guitar was around £800. It's not a crazy expensive guitar, it's not a handmade guitar or anything like that, but it sounds good, its intonation's good, and it can kind of take a beating as well, as you can see from the way I'm starting to go through the body of the guitar here. So I would recommend spending something like £400 on a guitar, and I do think as well that playing a steel string is probably going to make it a little bit easier and nicer for you to learn on as well, okay? So obviously when you're using the nylon strings, they're going to be a little bit kinder on your fingers, but just the amount of volume and the kind of projection and tone you get out of a steel string really lends to this rhythmic right-hand guitar playing. So you're going to, I think you probably have to put a little bit more sort of, not energy, but a little bit more emphasis on your technique when you're playing a nylon string if you're wanting to add in things like palm muting whilst you're strumming, which we're going to look at in later lessons. Okay, so if we move on to picks now, I personally play a Jim Dunlop Max Grip 0.73 guitar pick. Okay, so I generally would recommend sticking between a pick in the 0.5 range, and I wouldn't go any higher than a 0.88. So I think when you're first starting off, I would recommend a maybe slightly lighter pick. So if you want to use a 0.5 when you're first starting to get these rhythms down, that's totally fine. But I find with the 0.5 picks that they are a little bit too light if you're wanting to get any real sort of power, kind of when you're doing your palm muting whilst you're strumming, which again we'll look at in a later lesson. But for me, the 0.73 is the sweet spot between a really nice strumming tone and also a really nice picking tone as well. So, and also the only reason that I use the max grips over anything else is I find I need this slightly raised grip that the picks have on them, or the pick tends to slip between my fingers. So I would strongly recommend these picks, but if you're just starting off, 0.5 is totally fine, but you might find that it sounds a little bit kind of clicky. You get a lot of click sound off it. So I find that these 0.73s don't really have too much of a click sound, and the 0.88s you can get away with as well. But if you use anything above a 0.88, it's going to be pretty hard to do some of the faster strumming, and also I just think the tone isn't quite as nice for this style of guitar in general. So it'll start to feel pretty kind of clunky when you're playing anything above a 0.88 guitar plectrum. Okay, so moving on to strings now. I only use Elixir guitar strings, and I pretty much only as well use light strings, so they're 12 to 53s, okay? It doesn't matter if you're going to get the Elixir strings, if they're phosphorus bronze or not. I don't notice any difference in the tone, to be honest. But I would recommend in general going for these kinds of strings which are coated over non-coated strings. So I find with non-coated guitar strings, my strings will go dead, long before they break, and unfortunately it means, I feel like I need to change them before they've even, got close to the point where they're going to snap. So I can keep these strings on until they break. I only change my strings if they break, basically, or in a very sort of freak event if I've had them on for quite a few months. But I do tend to break a string at least once a month, I would say. So they're not crazy expensive, but they could be maybe twice the price of a really cheap set of strings, but they will last you, I'd say, 4 times as long as a sort of cheaper set. But I think Elixir over the other brands, their coating is just, I think it's very noticeably better. Okay, so I've tried using a few other brands that are coated, but they've tended to go dead, maybe not as quick as a really cheap set of strings, but the Elixirs will basically stay the same level of brightness and the same tone until they snap. Okay, so one other thing that I think is worth mentioning is in all my guitars I have these brass bridge pins. You can get these on Amazon. I'll link them in the description below as well, but they're sold with the idea that they're going to make your guitar louder, but that's actually not the reason that I use them. And to be honest, I couldn't really say if I do think they make the guitar louder or not, but the reason I use these brass bridge pins is because they're flat. Okay, they're totally flat tops. So in your standard bridge pins, they're slightly curved shape on top, and because these are flat, it means that they're basically in level with the strings. And when you get to the point, as I mentioned a few times in this video, when you're palm muting whilst you're strumming. So if we're strumming without palm muting, like this, and then we add in palm muting, we're going to go. So that's going to be a big feature of Celtic guitar, and it's the thing that kind of separates Celtic guitar strumming from a lot of other genres, really. So I find with these flat brass bridge pins, it's way easier to palm mute, and I've been using these for 10 years now. So whenever I play guitar now that doesn't have them, it feels very odd to me, and I can't get quite as nice a tone out of it. So I don't really want anything in the way of getting my palm touching the strings when I'm playing. So they're not too expensive, and I think they're worth a shot if you're learning to palm mute. It's going to make it easier for you to learn, for sure. And maybe I'm so used to them now, but maybe you will get a little bit more volume out of the guitar in general too. So the only other piece of gear that I use a lot for playing is a capo, and I use this G7th capo. You can see it's actually a little bit thinner than normal because it's actually an electric guitar capo that I use for my electric guitar, but it works perfectly well on the acoustic too. You can get plenty of pressure out of it. But I would say capos in general, I've used for multiple album recordings the cheapest sort of spring trigger capo that you could find on Amazon. You do not need to get an expensive capo at all. So if you're going to invest any money on, in guitar equipment at all, you're far better off spending it on strings or getting some of these bridge pins or something like that than investing it in a capo. The only advantage to this capo really is, you can choose the amount of pressure that's going on the neck, and I also just like the way that it releases. So you push it down to set your pressure, and then you push this little bit up to release it. So it's a little bit different than a normal spring loaded trigger capo. But do I think it's worth it to spend the amount of money one of these costs? Probably not. But when I tried it out, it's a little bit nicer to use, but it's definitely not worth the difference in price between a cheap capo off Amazon or something like that. Okay guys, so that covers basically all the essential equipment you're going to need for this style of guitar. If you'd like more full length lessons and detailed breakdowns on chords and strumming patterns, you can check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description below. But if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video in this series.